and welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. I'm Anna.
And I'm Victoria.
And we are educators trying to make sense of all the new literacy research and writing around phonics, the science of reading, and balanced literacy. As you may have heard in our first episode, the theories and reading pedagogy have truly been a pendulum swing coming and going since the 1950s. And as educators, Victoria and I think it's important to have discussions with experts in the field to help us make meaning of the new research and opinions. We are working with you to find some of the answers to the bigger questions like, what is literacy? We know that reading is only a part of the bigger goal, and we need to understand all of the components of what that bigger goal is. And we need to understand how we support our diverse populations across all the changes. Specifically, how do we support our English learners? How do we ensure that our emergent bilinguals leave school as proficient readers and writers in English and more languages?
And this is all about how do we make sure that while we have students in the educational system, that we get them to graduate as literate adults, right? And no matter what language they come to us with, that all of our students are literate adults. So today we are really excited and honored to be speaking with Dr. Laurie Olsen. Dr. Olsen has been an educator, a writer, an advocate for half of a century. She has her Ph.D. in social cultural studies and education. Dr. Olsen has designed and led demonstration projects, evaluation projects in English learner and immigrant education with a strong emphasis on educational equity. She has written dozens of books, articles, reports on effective schooling for language minority children and on equity-centered school reform. She is the child of a writer and been an avid reader since a child. For 20 years, Dr. Olsen has led California Tomorrow, a nonprofit organization focused on equity and diversity. She is the founder and director of the Sobrato Early Academic Language Model and a founding board member and now acting president of Californians Together, a coalition of an educational system that is funded and structured for every child will have a full access to high-quality 21st century education and will graduate from our public schools fully prepared for success in college and career and full civic participation. So welcome, Dr. Olsen.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We are so excited that you're here. This resume is so impressive. And we know that you're the perfect person to really start to talk about what is effective literacy instruction. What does it look like? What does it sound like?
Well, any kind of instruction needs to start with the why. What am I trying to accomplish? Why are we teaching this? And for me, literacy is about being able to pick up books, read, comprehend for pleasure, for information, for company. It's about being able to write, to put your words and your thoughts and your dreams and wisdom down on paper for others across time and across space, or just for yourself, because the process of writing clarifies so much thinking. So for our multilingual learners, it's all of that we want, and we want that for them in and across their multiple language and cultural worlds. So given that, if that's the goal of literacy education, when we think about what effective literacy education needs to be, certainly there are skills that are involved in being able to read, write words on a page, being able to comprehend and make sense of what's written. But it's more than that too, because kids have to be able to use writing and reading to be successful in school. It's a matter of access. It's a matter of participation. It's a matter of being able to be engaged academically. And so they need the skills for doing that in an academic world, and they need to be immersed in just the enormous pleasure and gift of what reading and writing are so they can use them for their voice, for their purposes, for their lives. So when I think about literacy instruction, it's about the tools and the skills, and it's about immersing them in the joy and the sense of the great gift that books and writing can be in their life. So in the classroom, there are children that come to school who have that immersion already, who have that sense of the wonder of books and the excitement of books. And there are kids that don't have that so much. But the classroom has to be a place where they're really just socialized into, embraced in this world of the wonders of print. So I think the motivation, the purpose, the sense of what books are all about is one of the crucial parts of literacy instruction. So what does that mean? What does that look like? That's teachers reading to them expressively, reading to them a wide variety of books that are funny, that break your heart, that touch your dreams. So it's very wide reading and involving kids in the talking about the reading and the response to the reading. That's bottom line. And for the youngest children, that's probably the most important part, that kind of immersion into it. But it's also them starting to get a sense of how print works, that these marks on a page represent sounds, that these sounds represent words, that words get put together into thoughts, and that's something that they can actively do with their own storytelling, with their own ideas. They can draw a picture and dictate it and see it turn into print. So early literacy instruction is really about those processes of understanding the concept of what print is all about, its purposes and its uses, and getting excited about it for themselves. In a classroom, it's really important to think about the different stages of becoming a reader, because we become readers over many years, and it looks different at different stages. But for a teacher in preschool, kindergarten, and even first grade, there's a lot of modeling of expressive language and engaging kids in the language they're going to encounter in books, because there's nothing more frustrating than going through the mechanics of sounding out the sounds of a word and having no idea what that word means, right? They need vocabulary. They need that oral language as a background for making sense of what they're reading. They need instruction in just the, particularly those who are learning literacy in English, which is a language with so many exceptions and so many ways that you can sound out a word 20 different ways and it would have different meanings. It takes real systematic, explicit instruction in how English works. Other languages like Spanish are more consistent, and it can be a different process for them. And so one of the things I think it's important to say about teaching reading, which is the subject you've given me, is it works best if you're taught in your strongest language, because you have the most vocabulary and meaning to apply to it. Mm-hmm. For children that come to literacy with another language and they're developing literacy in English, those two languages interact. And so it's important that we leverage that and help them see what's the same, what's the difference across their two languages, and help them understand that literacy applies in all languages.
So, you know what? I love this. I love this idea. And first of all, I think that you are totally speaking to Anna's and my heart about like creating this joy and excitement around reading and writing, that we have to cultivate that love for it. And that's such a huge part of making sure that all of our students are literate. But I really want to go back to kind of what you were saying about the languages interacting with each other. Mm-hmm. And if our students are coming in with another language other than English that they've spoken for the first 5 years of their life, how does that multilingualism play into this effective literacy? Could you talk some more about that?
Yeah. So when it's handled well, it's a huge boon to come in with another language and to be developing literacy in two languages, because you're developing this meta understanding of how language works. Oh, these symbols on a page in English, they represent these sounds, but in Spanish, they represent those sounds. And to be able to develop that deeper understanding of how it works, that it's not just a fundamental single system. So teaching it well means contrasting. It means, for the little ones, color coding the languages so you know whether you're applying the pronunciations of Spanish. If you see D-A-M-E, dame, instead of D-A-M-E, dame, right? Those are two different words, two different meanings. But so kids need that cueing. Oh, this is Spanish. Oh, this is English. And there are different sounds that go with them. And there are things that are the same. How wonderful. There are these cognates. There are these roots of words. So I can hear a word in English that I know in Spanish, and I can recognize the root of it, and then I can understand it, even though it's a new language to me. So that cross-language piece can be so wonderfully leveraged in helping kids develop literacy. The What we don't want to have happen is have them walk in as if they don't have a language, have them trying to learn to read in a language they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the sounds of the language, the phonology of the language, and to approach literacy that way. So invite their languages in, help them with that cross language. If you're a teacher that doesn't know their language, you can learn some basic things about the language. You can learn what are the sounds that are the same and what are the sounds that are different, which are the letters that are pronounced the same and which are not. You can learn things about the structure, like, oh, in Spanish, the adjective comes after the noun where instead of before the noun. So when kids are making their way through trying to read a sentence, they can understand what the structure is. So teachers need some training in that. It's not something that most of them have. And for those who are monolingual English speaking, it's particularly a lift for them, but it's wondrous when it's done well. You know, this reminds me of one other thing I meant to say earlier about effective literacy instruction, which is there is no one way. There really isn't. Children come with different strengths. Children come with different language facilities, different interests, and that the teacher is a crucial decision maker in that instruction, figuring out, oh, for this kid, if I could get a book about soccer, I bet I can just draw him into the world of this book and get it with the motivation that'll help him. For one thing, he probably has some vocabulary about soccer, so it'll help him in that book, but it's a book he wants to read. Oh, for this kid over here, she totally gets the delights of books. She's really struggling with some decoding skills. She doesn't quite understand what to do with blended consonants. So that's what she needs. So the teacher is really a diagnoser, not to make a medical model out of this, but an assessor of what it is that each child really needs around reading and needs to be able to feed that. So these kind of one-size-fits-all approaches to reading, you do this and then this and then this and then this and then this, ends up making some kids mark their time and other kids, left behind. So the teacher is just a really crucial piece of all of this.
Thanks so much, Dr. Olsen. I think as an early childhood, I've taught TK all the way through 5th grade, but definitely teaching those emergent readers and then considering the additional complexities of the emergent bilinguals. What I'm thinking about is, like you said, teacher prep and teacher knowledge, and really around the pedagogy of learning to read. And while all of those components are very complicated, we also have I should say, not necessarily super new, but newer conversations around what is the pedagogy specifically for emergent bilinguals or for students of different cultural backgrounds. So as we're teaching reading, how do we make sure that we prioritize that culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy? So from your perspective, can you share with us what are some of those considerations that you think are the most important when it comes to multilingual and multicultural learners?
One thing is the content of the material that we give them to read. It's really important that they see themselves in literature and in books and see the connection that the books are about me, are about my world, and don't leave me out. It's really important that they see books in their home language, whether or not the teacher is able to make it part of her own teaching. The existence of those books. Oh, books exist in my language, and connections to the families, family literacy projects, homeschool loan projects of books in the home languages. So kids are reading with their families in their home language while they're learning to read at home. So that connection, that this all applies to me, that I belong in books and books are mine, is a very important piece. But there's also that linguistic piece that I was discussing earlier, which is recognizing that languages have different structures and that languages have different sounds, and that if I am going to develop into a literate person for all of my cultural and language worlds, I have the right to literacy in both. And so that's a really important messaging from the system. Even when we can't necessarily teach it that way, we can certainly message it that way. And then also for children learning to read and developing as readers in English, if it's not their first language, we need to spend so much attention to building background knowledge and oral language. So reading does not stand on its own. Reading is part and parcel of language development for them, which means some extra time put into background knowledge and oral and vocabulary. It means good ELD instruction, where you're really spending time helping them understand the mysteries of how English is structured, and giving them a chance to practice it. That's all part of a strong literacy program for them.
I think that's the perfect segue to my next question, because as a former first grade teacher, given a specific curriculum by my district and said, this is what you need to use to teach kids how to read, that was a big responsibility on my part. And now we have multiple curriculum being used in our state, across the nation. And I think that it's really important that teachers, educators know what those characteristics of effective instruction, specifically for multilingual learners, looks like. So as a first grade teacher or a second grade teacher or even a fifth grade teacher, what should I be looking for in my materials that I know will help me to prioritize literacy for English learners?
Yeah. So one of the things is the materials, the curriculum packages that are bought, and given to teachers to use, really need to have good resources for teachers. You need to understand something about the languages that your children are coming with. And there are really wonderful transfer charts that you can get to see what applies across and what does not. So that's an important resource for teachers. Families and community are an important resource, bringing them into the classrooms to be reading with kids, to be and to have a presence in the classroom can make a really big difference. But there's another piece too, which is literacy. And now I'm speaking particularly for English learners, kids who are in an English program, but don't yet have enough English to really fully participate and understand everything. Language and literacy are key to access and participation. That's your way into that academic learning. And so through everything that is being taught in the day, there needs to be a language teaching and a literacy teaching aspect for our English learners. So, it's called scaffolding, which is an interesting term, but it's kind of holding up temporarily the extra supports that are needed for kids. But it's absolutely essential that if they're doing math, that the teacher is helping them understand the language of math and giving them some practice with the language of math. If they're doing history, social studies, and need to know cause and effect, they need to know the language structures of how you say, if this, then that. That's specific to English, right? So that is the ELD work, but it's also this ongoing consciousness for the teacher in whatever you're doing academically, that there's a language. There are language demands we're making on kids, and our English learners need support around that. That way, kids are getting it all across the day. They're not being precluded from accessing what everybody else is doing. They're being supported to participate fully in the classroom. So you can't think of literacy instruction just as something you do during your language arts block. It's an all day long.
So in my mind, I'm thinking of all those teachers' editions that we have in our classrooms. And quite often, regardless of the content area, have the lesson there in the middle, and then maybe down on the side, there's the little component that says support for English learners. And what I hear you saying is that if that support for English learners suggestion is creating access to the content, giving those language supports, giving that practice or suggestions on how to create some sort of a structure to allow English learners to participate, then that's what I should be paying attention to.
Yeah, it's not just a sidebar.
Yeah, I'm going to bring that over to the middle, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what else, Anna? The other thing that it made me think of is that, like, when we look at our math textbook, right, that little sidebar often isn't there. That there isn't that little like support for how do we support our English learners? How do we support in language? And so it's about also as the educator, like as the artist, so to say, weaving it together, right? Weaving those different teacher editions together. Like if I need language support here, I'm probably going to need it here too. And so what might that look like?
Yeah. I think there's another element too, which is it's not just the materials that are what we use. The environment of a classroom is so important for English learners, that what they're learning about is visual and hands-on and accessible, that there are charts around the classroom where kids are getting supports and scaffolds like sentence frames and help with the language, that what you're learning is coming alive and being made accessible to you in and around language. So you're not dependent only on understanding the language to access it. So I can tell walking into a classroom right away, is this a language-rich classroom? Is this a language-supportive classroom? Is this supportive for our English learners? Just by looking around the room.
Absolutely. As an early childhood, as a preschool teacher back before I became an elementary school teacher, we talked about that the classroom environment is your additional teacher, and that you're using that space to support learning at lots of different levels. And if kids can access the environment, then there's learning happening when the teacher isn't necessarily right there, supporting, which is really cool, because now we're looking at kids becoming independent learners and not dependent just on the teacher.
Right. Yeah.
What an impactful conversation we have had today with Dr. Olsen. Please join us next time in part 2 of our interview with Dr. Olsen, during which we will really start to talk about how we might partner more with our families and our communities to really meet the needs of our English learners. So for more information and to get access to the resources mentioned today, please visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org and make sure to subscribe to our podcast.